Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our joint state agency webinar on planning and addressing the natural disasters in schools. My name is Juan Morales. I'm Director of the School Facilities and Transportation Services Division here at the California Department of Education. And it's a privilege to be part of this webinar on this very important topic. Now, chances are that the vast majority of you watching this webinar are probably involved in building or modernizing schools in the traditional way. Most of the time, there's a planning process that involves the development of a facilities master plan, where you can evaluate the conditions of your existing facilities and you explore enrollment trends to identify any potential growth needs. And then from these plans, districts can make well-informed decisions on which projects to prioritize when seeking local support for bonds and ultimately pursue state funding to build or modernize. Unfortunately, there's also a different path that some of you have taken or will have to take. And that's when you have to build or modernize because your facilities are either damaged or destroyed by a disaster. Now, this situation requires a different planning process, and you will most likely have to address different situations. Today, we're going to talk about this different path. And quite frankly, I wish that we weren't having this discussion. I wish that we didn't experience natural disasters that impact schools in California. But as you all know, that's just not a reality. Emergencies and disasters are more frequent. They're much more complicated. They are now involving multiple counties and regions of the state all at the same time. And it seems like the recovery for our communities is taking much longer. Over the past 5 years alone, we've experienced an unprecedented amount of emergencies and disasters. And we're going to talk more about those specifics. But that's why it's important to have this conversation. It's also a conversation that's very timely, as the governor has proclaimed this week as the Wildfire Preparedness Week of 2022. So we have a great lineup for you today. You will hear directly from school district and county office of education representatives that have been on the front lines of responding to a major wildfire. From the Paradise Unified School District, we have Tom Taylor, who is the superintendent. From the Butte County Office of Education, we have Tad Alexander, who is the Associate Superintendent of Statewide and Local Support Services. You will also hear a joint presentation between the Governor's Office of Emergency Services and the California Department of Education. From Cal-OES, we have Nick Murray, who is the Senior Emergency Services Coordinator of the Emergency Functions Planning Unit. From CDE, we have Joe Anderson, Manager of our Emergency Services team, and we have Jake Wolf, who is a specialist in CDE's Emergency Services team. You're also going to hear from our colleagues from the Division of State Architect. With us today is Ida Clare, our State Architect, Harlan Raymond, Principal Architect and Regional Manager of the Sacramento Office, Eric Dreber, who is the Principal Architect in Headquarters, and Dessa Rooney, the Principal Architect and Regional Manager of the Oakland Office. And then you're going to hear from our colleagues from the Office of Public School Construction. Joining us from OPSC today is Ms. Lisa Silverman, the Executive Officer of OPSC, and Brian LaPaz, who is the Operations and Program Manager of Program Services. So let's get started. We're going to start off by having a panel discussion with two people that I got to know really well because of the campfire. And I completely admire and respect them for all that they were able to achieve under the most difficult conditions. Tom and Tad, thank you again for being with us today and for being part of the discussion. So let's get started. I think everyone has seen and heard about the destructive nature of a campfire, but it's important to get the perspective from the people on the ground. Tom, can you please just walk us through that very first day when the fire started?
I'd like to say that's the first time I've ever been muted on screen and as I tried to talk, but it's not. So before I jump into that, I just want to say that, seeing some of these people on this list, the organizations out there, I don't want to forget to say thank you because so many of you people out there helped us get our district actually survive and get it to where we're now moving ahead. And I was looking at some of the pictures that I haven't really gone through over the last for quite a while. An example, the one uses my background. And then I was looking at our construction that's happening, and I was looking at the names and the people and the organizations. And I just want to be sure and say thank you. Incredible, because without so much support, we wouldn't be where we are, and we're not where we need to be, but I guarantee you we wouldn't be where we are. So thank you. So yeah, let me. So I'm going to drop back to November 7th, and so why November 7th? We passed a bond, a $61 million bond on November 7th. And I think it's first bond our district has passed since I've been with the district, and I'm going on over 20 years now. And it was, so our district was kind of I'll say at an all-time high. And then November 8th, and the most destructive wildfire that we had seen in California. It destroyed 85% of our town. There were 14,000 homes lost and a total of 19,000 structures. And I put the picture up here behind, and there's many more that I could show, but it's kind of hard to think about what the 85% is when you think of a community. But just over my left shoulder, that's one of our schools, and it's just completely gone. It's the elementary school I went to. You look across the street from the school and you see that the businesses that were across the street from the school are gone. In the upper left-hand corner, you see a couple businesses that made it. And then just above my head to the left, you see our Honey Run Academy, which is our community day school. It's gone. Top right-hand side, we have our solar panels made it in our transportation department. And, you see our bus shed there and then we have all of our storage, our maintenance building, all that destroyed. But you think of 85%, you stood in the community and the majority of it was gone. It's hard to imagine unless you see it, what really 85% looks like. Little bit about that day. On that morning, I actually stepped out my house and looked across, and I could see the fire burning across the mountain. And it was on kind of the southeast side of town. I'm 8 minutes from the nearest school, and I told my wife, I said, Laura, you need to start packing some stuff. I said, the wind was actually blowing towards our house at that point in time, and I really thought it'd be one of the first to be gone, and wasn't. We were fortunate that our house wasn't burned, but we then had drove. It was. You could still see blue sky when you left my house. 4 minutes after that, getting up to about the hospital area, and you've probably seen videos of the hospital, my mind starts shifting. I mean, I knew it was bad, but you get to the hospital and it's pretty dark. I mean, you're starting to hear transformers explode. You're hearing I don't know if they're propane tanks or whatever it is going off. And then you got up to the school, which was the first school, which was I felt was our priority for evacuation that day. And at that school, we were just beginning school. Parents were pulling up, getting their kids, letting their kids out of the car. And of course, we were telling them, no, take your students home. But by that time, we probably had about half the school already there. Made an immediate call for buses to start evacuating our students. And of course, buses were trying to get to the schools, had buses going to the schools that I thought were most impacted. Some of our buses never made it to the schools because they couldn't get through traffic. But at that school right there, we ended up getting there's about 200 students that we got evacuated. And you guys probably heard the story about the students that went out on the bus. Many of the others were picked up by their parents. And we're sure to be that school was evacuated. I couldn't even tell you the exact time, but eventually had that school evacuated. And I was the last person at the school, made a last sweep of the school, and was standing there and look out and realized that I can't go anywhere in my truck, and ended up figuring, well, the best way is just start walking, and ended up walking to our district office where where David McCready was, our assistant superintendent, and unfortunately he couldn't be with us there today. But traffic was horrible. You couldn't even move. You couldn't get cars going anywhere. And he and I had a conversation about how we were going to get out of there, but really the priority, how we were going to be sure kids were out of there. And we decided that we were going to go ahead and walk to the schools that we could get to, and so I started walking, and we got down to the area of our high school, and we were looking across the road, and it was fully engulfed in flames, the road we were going to take. And about that time, we got a phone call from somebody who had spoken to the assistant principal, Larry Johnson, and Larry Johnson is he's a veteran. He's a war veteran. He's been in very difficult situations, and we were informed that he said that school was completely evacuated. He was the last person there, and it was clear. And kind of an interesting thing, because I'm not sure what would have happened, because I think we probably would have walked down the road to the school. And that decision probably had a big impact on mine and David's life right there. But we headed down back to the elementary schools, and the school that you see behind me, Honey Run Academy, and the transportation department. By the time we reached there, those schools had been completely evacuated. We also had another school that's it was just to the west of there, and actually the majority of that school made it. We're using that school, and we were sure that those schools were evacuated, and then started walking out of town, and headed down to the police department is kind of on our way. There's actually a group of students that had made it to the police department in a police van, and met them there. We checked on them, got them out on another police van, and they were headed out of town. And David and I, actually we checked a couple more schools on the way, and walking out of town, and got to the end of town, and people were telling us, you can't walk out, the flames are too bad. And fortunately, we were able to jump in and people were helping people, and we weren't the only people getting rides, but there was an individual driving a white Ford pickup, and I haven't talked to this individual since that day, and really don't even know his name. He looks at us and he says, you guys need a ride? And we jumped in the back of the truck and headed down the wrong way on Skyway to get out of the fire. And I don't know, it was probably 2.5, 3 hours from the initial fire. But that's kind of what the first day was looking like. And a huge thing for us was our evacuation plan. Sorry, give me a second. We didn't lose any students that day. We lost 83 people in our community. But it was a big thing that the staff did to be sure no student or staff lives were lost. Sorry, that one always hits me when I think about that. I'd sit there in nights following the fire, watching the TV and seeing how many lives were lost, and praying none of them were our kids, and that we did get them all out safely, because we didn't know. Did an incredible job of evacuation, but got our kids down to Chico in the fairgrounds. Was our initial evacuation place. Parents started picking kids up, and we had some tremendous staff making things happen down there, because our staff beat me down to the evacuation point by hours, and they had the reunification process going on. So that was kind of the first day, and at that point, we weren't sure what was going to happen with Paradise Unified School District, or really what had happened, to be quite honest with you. So Juan, was there something else you wanted me to touch on there, or is there anything?
No, I think that's great, Tom. And again, I realize that it's not easy to relive those moments, and thank you for sharing. I think what's important here too is just for people to understand how real this is and how impactful it is. And it's so impressive that, in the midst of, facing danger, you guys were worried about the students at the same time. So thank you once again. And another really important partner and leader during emergencies is the County Office of Education with jurisdiction over the area. Tad, you want to just walk us through, your first day in the first day of the fire, please?
Sure. Thanks, Juan. So as Juan mentioned, partnerships are key. And I was down in Sacramento meeting with CDE the day the fire started. And so on our way back up, we actually drove back into the fire, not knowing that that's what we were doing. And we could watch it come down to the freeway. And I don't live in the foothills, so that gives you an idea how fast the fire was moving. And my house was under evacuation down in the valley. So we had to prep for that. But in the meantime, we were making phone calls. And, Tom mentioned that all the students were being brought together with their parents, and we had staff down there helping out with that. And in addition to that, we had our IT staff trying to help tap into the digital roster and bring that up so that we can make sure everybody's being matched with the right parent. A number of those things happen, and Tom will back me up on this, but what we found, one of the things that came out of this fire was the strengthening of our relationships within the county between all our agencies and all our districts, because it takes everybody to make it happen. And we started calling, we had to check on our own staff. We had schools and students up there as well. And so we had to check on our own staff, see what the status was, find where people are, find where our students are, make sure our students were out. And Cal-OES and other agencies are able to run what they call 2 deep, which means they have a backup person. And so one of the key roles that COE provides is a buffer between the district and everybody else coming and looking for information. So the districts can work with the kids and work with the parents and work with the families. And then we try to add a little bit of a buffer for all the different agency interaction. And I think that was one of our key roles once we spun up our EOC is to go ahead and act as that buffer so that Tom and his team can focus on healing the families, working with the families, working with the kids, those immediate needs, and we handle the agency requests. And that's how we provide 2 deep in an emergency right now. Is the COE hops in, works with the district, and since 2017, that's when the dam event happened, Orville Dam spillway event. Butte County has had an emergency declaration every year since then. So we're getting good at dealing with them, for better or worse. One of the side benefits of that is right now I could spin up my EOC at our county level in probably about 2 or 3 hours. The whole EOC would be spun up, maybe sooner. And whether that's a badge of that we've earned along the way that we deserve or not, but it's something we can do. So I could go through that whole day. I think what's important is to know also during this time when we were evacuated for fire, some people were also evacuated for flood just a couple of days later. And so it was boom, boom, boom. And in that response time, you have to kind of pick up, a battle rhythm and the way that you respond. And I think that's one of the key things we did fairly soon as our superintendent came in and let us know. In education, we like to have consensus, and we like to have pull in lots of discussions and make sure everybody's happy with the decisions moving forward. In an emergency situation, becomes a command decision, and we let our staff know that that was going to be the case. These decisions are going to be made. It's not that you're not valued; it's that we have to make quick decisions. And I think that's important for people to know that switch has to be made, and you need to let your staff know that you're going to be making that switch. Not because they're not valued, but because decisions need to be made quickly to keep things moving. That's some of the things we did right away, Juan, and of course we reached out to CDE and, Cal-OES and Fema were stepping in, and we started, all those new partnerships and relationships that carry through to today. And I can go into a bunch of that a little bit later on.
Just if I could share real quick too, if this would be all right. You're speaking of our staff. We had almost 400 staff. 190 of those staff lost their homes, and another 80 had been displaced. And so people, with that magnitude of a fire, the impact is you had people losing their homes and and families that lost both incomes all at the same time. All 3 of those things happening. So just huge.
Thanks again, Tad and Tom. And I can't stress enough the importance of having that strong relationship between the school district and the COE during emergencies. It's very helpful. And it's hard. Not only are you dealing with personal evacuations and the impacts of staff, but you're also realizing that schools are damaged or completely destroyed. How do you start the planning process to temporarily house these students, Tom? How did you guys start thinking, okay, well, first we got to figure out where they're at, obviously, but then, the town is pretty much gone. Where are we going to keep them together with their teachers? How does that thought process begin?
Yeah, I kind of hit on it earlier. Initially, we weren't even sure is Paradise Unified School District going to exist. That wasn't an option that we wanted, but you mentioned the effort initially is just really locating people. That's where our initial efforts went. Where were our staff? Where were our students? Was everybody okay? From there, we started gathering. We had some conversations with Butte County Office of Ed. We had some conversations, of course, within our district. And I think what Dad said about, at some point it becomes command decisions, and that's what has to happen in a situation like this. And what we realized, we found out that we weren't able to return to our community for many cases over a month. And we weren't able to use the facilities. I mean, that came 6 months later. So we had to determine where we were going to house. We did have 2 sites on in the far north side of our district that we were able to access. They were our smallest schools. So we started looking at really business facilities. We started talking to other districts. Chico Unified, Orville, Durham were very helpful in helping us get locations. So it was like everybody on our leadership team turned into real estate agents, and we're looking for possible properties that we might be able that were large enough to house students. And one of the things that, I don't know if everybody's heard the story, but we had school we had our high school in a Facebook building, by the airport. Where does that happen, right? And we also had our middle school, our intermediate school was put in a hardware store, the Osh building, so you had English on aisle 9, and that's, that was kind of how they divided up the school. But then we Orville Unified or Orville Elementary, they allowed us to use one of their facilities at they actually moved teachers from a small 8-room school to another school. They combined their school, allowed us access to that building. We were able to get portables on there, which is a whole nother story. Durham did a similar thing. They kind of gave us a section of their school and allowed us to put portables up. But how we got started at it was really people just reaching out, our staff reaching out, contacting agents, contacting the owners of buildings, trying to find out how we could make this happen. But it also included conversations with many other organizations about we couldn't go through the standard process. I mean, we had to do this in 3 weeks. So it was, organizations allowing us, once again, those that are on this meeting right here, allowing us to, fast track things and to really make things happen that don't normally happen. And the example is the school at the airport. It was getting with other organizations and asking for them to kind of give us some leeway, flexibility, move us to the top of any list that we needed, to be sure that we could, sidestep some of the barriers that can be in place under normal situations. And I think that's a critical piece that we saw happen and always needs to happen, is that there has to be some changes or I don't want to say changes. There has to be that opportunity to sidestep some of the barriers that can be in place under normal times when you're dealing with an emergency.
Tom, if I could add to that, one of the things I like to do is look at things by the numbers. And one of the interesting things that happened is the portables that Tom was speaking of. That's 11 portables on 2 different campuses. 11 portables went up in 11 days with Christmas and rain in between. And that is because CDE was at the table, DSA was at the table, the mobile providers put us at the front of the line, PG&E brought us to the front of the line, the contractor that did the work brought us to the front of the line. I think that's what, if I want to share something with somebody, if you're in this situation, just ask people. You need to ask people to move you to the front to get things moving. And the reason getting these kids back into stable facilities is so important is because you need to give the parents time to do adult things. They need to deal with insurance. They need to deal with FEMA. They need to be able to figure out where the food's coming from. Where are they going to live temporarily now that their house is gone? But if everybody hadn't come together to make that happen, I don't know how those portables would have gone in as quick as they could have. And, we had, what we call it, Tom, the first day of the second first day of school. And we got everybody back in. And that was mission critical to getting these kids back together and healing. That's something Tom can speak to a little bit more. But it's important to know that when you pull the whole village together, man, you can get some crazy good things done for everybody. But it takes talking, and it takes a community to pull together. And everybody on this panel right here, and I'm looking across, I'm looking at all the titles and all the what I call the alphabet soup of all our different organizations and agencies. It takes everybody to pull this together, especially when you have a field act to deal with, and getting the field act waived. I mean, that's something we spoke to Juan's team about, and he took that to the governor. We got the field act moved out of the way, which helps, which is why we could be at an airport or near an airport with some kids. But there was no other option. We were short buildings. It's not something that was just going to happen.
Yeah. Real quick again, if it's okay, Juan. You mentioned about the kids being together. That kind of started with the conversation. I actually asked my daughter. It was a couple days. I said, "What do the kids want?" Julia, she said, and she went back and they talked to her friends. They said, "We want to be together," and I think that's a real critical piece. And there was conversation a little bit about just sending kids to different schools within within the local areas. Could have worked maybe, but it was very important for the healing process. And the healing process isn't over, but it was very important for the kids to be with their friends, and it was very important for them to be with their teachers. And we found that to be probably one of the best things for the social emotional wellness of our kids and staff was to be together. And that's what our parents wanted. Our parents really felt that was important. And once again, it really became a driving force, and wouldn't have happened without, some of the flexibility taking place.
And I think that's key for everybody that's on this webinar with us, because everybody here is involved in facilities in one way or the other, and know that, it may be, I just do facilities. Well, in an emergency after something like this, the facility in a rural area, and I would argue in a number of other towns, is the heart of the community. And so your educational facility that houses the children houses probably about 50% of the population that's been affected. And if you are able to get that going, you can get the heart of that community up and moving. And that starts the whole process of getting everything back online. So I mean, don't take I just do facilities as something lightly. It's a huge responsibility. It makes a great big difference. I mean, that's one of the things Tom and I can pull away from this for sure, is providing a facility for people to get together back in their community and just back with each other is one of the most important things that I think came out of this for us, that I don't think I knew the importance of that.
Yeah, I would agree. And I feel very badly for those people who were dealing with similar situations during COVID, because they couldn't get the together time, which I think is so critical.
Thanks, Dad and Tom. And again, it's important to touch on that, because even though this webinar is focused on facilities, the impacts go beyond the facilities. I mean, it directly impact the students and staff. And that, could be part of a long-term recovery process. But I do want to go back to something that both of you had mentioned, and that's the interim housing challenges. This particular case was extremely hard because there was no other, districts nearby that you could use the facilities. You had to go a long ways away. So it posed some unique challenges. But one thing that I want everybody just to realize and understand is that everybody's willing to help. I mean, obviously, we are involved during response efforts, working really closely with Cal-OES, but this is a big priority, not just for our state superintendent, for the governor's office, and that's why everybody was willing to help. This is a unique situation. We need to find creative solutions. We don't want students to be in buildings that are not, subject to the standards that we have, but we had no alternatives. We had no other options. And everybody pulls together to try and find creative solutions. And that's how the governor issued an executive order to be able to use, that school next to the airport, the old store building, because they're unique. And again, the point here is that there's people that are willing to help, but you're going to encounter some challenges. And interim housing has been one of the biggest ones that I've encountered in dealing with schools that have been damaged or destroyed. And that's just a short-term, right, solution in terms of having the students there right away. And Tom touched on the importance of bringing the students back with their teachers. But then there's a long-term recovery, a rebuilding process, right, in terms of, okay, now let's start trying to plan how we build back the schools. With temporary housing in place, how do you begin that long-term rebuilding process? Working with the other state agencies, Tom, in terms of, hey, let's build back the schools. We got the students right now in a good place. Well, as good as it could get at that, given that situation. But starting to rebuild and go through the somewhat traditional process of working with the state agencies.
I think a lot of the things applied what we talked about earlier with, how we were able to get into temporary housing. We had a huge, there was mass destruction. We had 9 sites that were burned. We had 9 sites. 4 were burned. 9 sites damaged or burned. 4 of them were burned. 3 of them were damaged beyond repair. And so, I mean, it was the damage that took place up here was extensive. And once again, you couldn't go through, we needed to be there to ask questions, and thank goodness we had the opportunity to build those relationships early on. I guess, thank goodness, we would much not prefer not to go down the road ever, but the opportunities that we had to build relationships with the different organizations really helped us in the rebuilding process, because once again, we needed to ask, can we be put to the top of the line? Can things be fast tracked to move forward? I have some beautiful pictures that I was just looking at before we started, and thinking, man, I can't believe we went from this picture behind me to what we're dealing with right now. And we met with DSA in the Sacramento office. They were real helpful in expediting the review of our projects so the rebuilding could happen. CDE also very helpful in moving this forward. We were fortunate in one aspect is that we had a facilities master plan already. We needed to modify it greatly after this. But I would say, it was the organizations putting us at the front of the line, making us a priority, seeing the needs that really had to, the things that had to happen in order for us to get to a place where, as a district and as a community, school's the heart of the district many times, especially when you're in a small community like ours. And if the district wouldn't have made it through or survived, the impact on the community would have been it would have been devastating. You come back to our community now, and November 11th, everywhere you stood, you might have been lucky to see a building standing. Now, everywhere you stand, you see probably 4 or 5 new homes going up. And that wouldn't have happened at that pace without these organizations putting Paradise Unified as a priority and moving us forward as quickly as we have.
Thanks, Tom. And I know that, in addition to CDE and DSA supporting, I know that OPSC was also very instrumental in helping to, help with the funding applications, get into the state allocation board, and get support from the funding side.
Yeah.
One other thing that I wanted to mention too, Tad, because you've been, from the beginning, you were there with the Butte COE and really helping to organize and coordinate with all of the different, not just state, but federal agencies and working with those partnerships, from, connecting with the state agencies, from working with, the other districts, Oroville, Durham, to help support. But the COE, was a key partner in this, and I think a lot of it was coordinating and helping. Can you just touch on that, on the importance of having those relationships? And then also, let's not forget to mention, the unmet needs, right?
Right.
And mentioning that.
So I'm going to back up just a second though to what Tom had, and then I'll go into some of that. But Tom reminded me of something I think is important for everybody here to know is when you are beginning the recovery in schools, CBOs and facility directors and people that work with money try to figure out what color is my money? What are the rules with my money? When is it coming so I know what I can spend? And what I'll tell you is in an emergency like this, when you start the recovery process, you need to let go of all those rules we're used to. They don't serve you. You need to have action. And then what that means is you need to spend money and you will get that money back later, maybe. But the other side is if you don't spend money, you won't have a district and you won't have a school and it won't matter. So you need to spend your money and then figure out the process later on how you recover it. The recovery process will look something like insurance will come in first, then you'll have FEMA come in, and then Cal-OES will come in and pick up the end of that. And then you're left holding a small, I can't remember, I didn't want to say it's like 3.47%, something like that you're left holding at the end. But then if you have donations along the way, that can backfill some of that. So there's a whole process to get your money back, and it's doable. We're going through the process. Paradise Unified is going through the process of recovery, and the money does come back in. But the key is you have to, and especially when you're working with your CBOs, is remind them, we have to spend the money to get something started or we'll have nothing. And that's a hard one for people in our industry to get over and start doing, but it's key. Tom, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but.
It's key. And I think that's an area that we probably could have done better in, is trying to hire more people for support in many different areas. We had a lot of people, that we hired and actually are still with us in some form, but for support. But we were hesitant often because we were, well, where's the money coming from? And looking back, exactly what Tad said is that it did come back, and you're always aware of your budget. You're trying to be conscientious of your spending, but that's a time when you need help, and it would have been beneficial for us probably to spend a little more than we did in hiring people. You're afraid to do it, but you can't be afraid to do it.
So, Juan, back to your question. I keep referring it to the alphabet soup, and whenever I talk to people, I put a can of alphabet soup up, and we all look at all the letters in there. And if you look across the screen now, you're going to see some DSA, some CDE, some COE, some USDs, and there's some Cal-OES out there, I'm sure. So you've got a lot of letters. And what's important when we're working with everybody who's got a lot of letters is to know how they speak, to know their language. One of my favorites is unmet need. And if you're going to write anything down, write down the word unmet need, because that is a trigger word for everybody that's going to help you. that gives them the ability to run it up the flagpole and find the resources for you. And an example I'll give you is we could not find any air purifiers. We're all gone because everybody had bought them all up in our local area. And even if we went out, 90 miles, we couldn't get any air purifiers. So we went to, I think it was Cal-OES or CDE, and said, hey, I can't hold a school with smoke in it. We need air purifiers to clean everything out, and so we can get people back in. And that problem was solved because it was an unmet need for me. One of my other favorite words that I learned along the way was exigency. Now, I cannot spell that for you, but I will tell you that helps when you're doing your procurement process, because basically that is something that FEMA uses. It's a definition within FEMA as far as how you can go about the procurement process. Also, if you're a district, you'll need to pass a resolution that allows you to do emergency response, so that will take you outside of your normal bid practices. These are all important things to take into consideration as you try the recovery process, because when you go back to try to get that money that I told you is available, you need to make sure you have documented your procurement process, or FEMA will say no thank you. And you need to make sure you document the federal procurement process. So we can go into that. People speak for hours and hours on how to go through that process. I'm not going to, but I will tell you that there are ways to make sure that you get reimbursed and to just be aware of them. But again, don't stop spending the money. Don't be paralyzed by that, because there's ways to work within the system. You just need to get hold of someone at FEMA, or Cal-OES is probably a better place to go, so that you make sure you are doing the correct documentation. And someone's going to be able to help me remember 214. That is the paper you fill out to document your hours, so you can go ahead and start getting reimbursed for documented hours. We keep track of your time on the way through. That's an important thing. If you're working with Paradise Unified School District, or I'm working with my own COE, just keep track of what you've got going on. And again, be able to speak the language of the people that are helping you. And I think that'll be very important.
Thanks again, Tad and Tom. I realize that we're going a little over our time, but it's really important for folks to hear directly from you guys. But I can't end this panel discussion without asking you probably one of the most valuable questions is, what did you learn? What would you do differently, and what would you recommend to others that may experience a similar disaster? Tom and Tad, whoever wants to.
Yeah, I think one of the things that they definitely, I mentioned earlier, is definitely hire more people. But some of the learns are you have to act really quickly in a situation like this, and because not only are we looking for buildings to house people, FEMA is, everybody's looking for a location where they can bring in their organization. And, there were multiple times when we found a building and they said, oh, somebody's already got it. And it just happens that way. So you have to act very quickly. This isn't really on the facility side, but I can't let it go without saying it, that the practicing drills and unification. I mean, I can't say we ever practice for a drill or a disaster at this magnitude, but the drills that we did do on a regular basis made a big difference. Having the plan for reunification, critical. You have to communicate constantly with everybody, all the different organizations you're working with, as well as your staff. And probably one of the most important that I could say is that this is more a district, or a district level, is in a disaster like this, in the initial the immediate time the disaster happens, you overreact. And I suggest you do that. And what do I mean by that? This fire coming up the canyon, I talked about what it was like at my, with the school there. You could hear the fire coming. It sounded like a train, 100 miles an hour winds, right? I mean, it was coming through here. We couldn't get out fast enough. And, so you don't take an emergency situation like this lightly. If you think something's coming, take major steps and overreact as opposed to wait or think it's not going to be a big issue.
Thanks, Tom. Tad?
So I think I already beat up the spending part. Everybody's heard that one. EOC, being able to practice and spin up your EOC quickly, identify the members of your EOC before you have to identify them in the middle of an emergency. We've all had our ICIS training. You know, it's a real thing, and you need to take it serious and at least put some thought into who fits in each role. Donations can be overwhelming. Everybody wants to help, and it's coming from the right place, but sometimes it's not something you necessarily need. Both Tom and I received more backpacks than we have kids in the county, which means then we have to do something with backpacks. So again, it's coming from the heart, but it becomes a storage problem. So that's one of the other things. And I'd throw out, reach out for help. Call someone who's been there. Call Tom, call Tad, call someone that's been through it. And so we can give you a leg up. Someone should learn from everything we had to go through. It shouldn't be something that we just go through and falls away to the side. You know, reach out to CDE, reach out to folks that can help you. And Joe and Jake are out there now, and they're a great resource for you. So I put calls out. And take care of your people. So one of the second day after the fire, we pulled in all of our staff and we had a discussion with them. We're all emergency workers. Those of you who haven't lost homes and haven't been immediately affected by the fire are working all the time. And it's going to take a lot of hours, and it's going to take, you know, a long time, but that's what it takes to bring our community back and make it better. And everybody responded well, had no problems, but it does take long hours, and letting people know that ahead of time. So I think those are the lessons learned, Juan.
Tad mentioned something about the backpacks, and this may sound a little harsh, but it's okay to say no, and sometimes you have to when people want to offer or do something, because a lot of those times you'll find out that it ends up being work placed up on people within your district who are already maxed out. And so you really have to think about that part is, you know, is appreciate the help, appreciate the offer, but it's okay to say no, and you'll feel bad, but it is okay.
Thanks again, Tom and Tad. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here today. I know that this is valuable information for other districts, so I really appreciate it. We're now going to shift and we're going to have you hear from the different state agencies that are involved, so they can explain how they can help you during emergencies. Next up, we're going to have a joint presentation between Cal-OES and CDE. And one of the reasons why this is a joint presentation is because we work really closely together during response and recovery efforts, you know, to help schools. We have become strong partners, and that's why we're going to have this joint presentation by Cal-OES and CDE and share some information just about emergency management in general, and then some specific ways we can help you. So can we have the next presenters, please?
Juan, you want me to kick it off, or you want me to, or let Joe do it? Okay. All right. Sorry about the awkward silence there. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nick Murray. I work for Cal-OES. I'm in our emergency planning functions unit. Among some of the different topics that we cover in our area is animal response, mass care and shelter, school emergency planning, and a few other different titles that we work on. Joining me today is Joe Anderson from the California Department of Education, and he and I are going to talk back and forth over some of the different things that we do during an emergency. So without further ado, let's go ahead to the next slide, please. So this is the hierarchy that we kind of work with at Cal-OES that really focuses on school emergency management at the end of the day. So over the last few years, and to kind of piggyback off Tad and Tom's panel discussion earlier, I cut my teeth working at OES on the Camp Fire back in 2018. I learned so much from that particular event, and it has helped us immensely as we've moved forward from that event on better ways to serve the community, better ways to serve the counties. But as one of the things that we created prior to that, which was the schools task force, the hierarchy that you kind of see here, you have Lynn, Noel, myself, and Danielle. The four of us make up the Cal-OES portion of that schools task force. And we work closely with Juan and his team on dealing with all of those, as Tad said, unmet needs that the county offices of education will come up with throughout their disaster that they're dealing with. So this is just our half of it. If we go on to the next slide, I think Joe will introduce his team.
That's right. Thank you, Nick. So this is our team, kind of our setup here. We have Abel, who's our new Deputy Superintendent of Operations and Administration's branch over at the California Department of Education. He's worked in emergency management in the past, and we're super excited to kind of get his new perspective on his ideas for emergency management as time goes on. And of course, there's Juan, who you've been hearing from, quite a bit today already. He's the director of the School Facilities and Transportation Services Division, and he was the man with the dream who brought this team together. He was maybe willingly, maybe unwillingly pulled into it back in 2017, and he's learned, so much, and he's realized there is a need for emergency management in schools, which is why he hired this new team, which consists of me, Joe Anderson, and Jake Wolf, and I'm the manager of the emergency services team, and Jake is the specialist. So it's not a huge team at this time, but we work very closely with a lot of resources that we have, including Cal-OES and CDPH and OPSC and all these other state agencies, the alphabet soup, as Tad likes to put it. So that way we can, even though there's only a few of us here, we're able to kind of collaborate and coordinate with all the resources that are needed for schools to recover and respond to disasters. So next slide, please. So let's talk about the background a little bit. So it's been a really bad past decade for California. Pretty much any disaster that could have happened in California has happened in California. Starting back in 2014, and it goes back further than this, but that's really when like the big drought was hitting, and it dried up California significantly, and then we started really getting some fires that during those years. And then in 2017, that was the really big year where we had winter storms right at the beginning of the year, back to back, that just hit all of California really hard, so bad that there was flooding everywhere, and there was the Oroville spillway incident, and that's where Cal-OES and CDE kind of really partnered up there. Not that CDE wasn't concerned about emergencies in schools before, but now we had this partnership, which wasn't really there before that. So we had to deal with the spillway incident, which is the largest evacuation event in California to this day, as far as I know. And then also we had wildfires that happened later that year that were devastating. They destroyed whole communities. And because they were impacting schools as part of those communities, and as Tad and Tom were mentioning, these facilities, these schools are kind of like the heart of the community. So we realized, we really need to be involved in this, early on. Like as soon as the disaster is happening, we need to really kind of be in touch with schools, figure out what their unmet needs are, and kind of share that with Cal-OES and make sure that we're all talking the same language and we're getting the resources to the right places at the right time. So in 2018, we had the second most fires in a single year, and we had mudslides to follow, and that was the year of the Camp Fire that Tad and Tom were talking about. So that was the most destructive and the deadliest fire ever to happen in California, wildfire in California history. And in 2019, there were still more fires. There was an earthquake, and that's when PSPS really started. And that's the public safety power shutoff events. And those really negatively impacted schools, because without power, how can schools operate? So that was a huge issue, especially with what came the next year, which was COVID-19. So when COVID-19 hit and we had the remote learning, when PSPS events, really went into full swing that year, it really impacted schools. Plus, we had a lot of civil unrest that year, and we had the largest fire in California history that year, which was I believe, the LNU complex fire. So it was multiple fires that combined together to make this gargantuan fire that was over 1 million acres burned. And then in 2021, we didn't really get a break. We had the second largest fire. And this is the single largest fire. This was the Dixie fire. So it went across multiple counties in Northern California, and it burned for just so long. It was ridiculous. But this was the second largest fire in California history, but the first single largest fire. It wasn't a complex fire. And we also had COVID-19 to deal with during that time, more civil unrest. We had winter storms right at the end, and kind of a cold snap too, which really just kind of threw a wrench into things with PSPS sprinkled out throughout the year. So it was a pretty rough year, during last year. And this year we're still kind of dealing with COVID-19 guidelines and regulations. We're in drought conditions right now, and there are wildfire conditions right now. So we're anticipating it's going to be an earlier fire season, and it's probably going to be, a bad fire season as it has been in the past few years. We're hoping it's not. I'm knocking on wood right now, but it's we're expecting the worst and hoping for the best. Next slide, please. All right. So to continue with the background here, why is this important to schools? We did kind of mention that, when these communities are impacted, they, impact the schools as well, which are the heart of the communities in many places. So since just 2017, since we got involved, 37 school facilities have been damaged or completely destroyed. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot. And each of these facilities takes tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to really get back up and running. And it takes a long time. So it's a huge, huge effort to get these schools back up and running. And these have happened across 8 different counties. So it's not just Butte, although Butte does get hit every year, unfortunately. But it's 8 different counties that this has happened in, 9 different fires that have caused this destruction. And on top of that, you have all these other things you have to worry about, these other disasters. And I kind of already mentioned all of them, but even if the school's not directly impacted by a fire, you can see from the picture on the left here, that's California covered in smoke from one fire. And we've had such large fires that we kind of share our smoke with all of our neighboring states as well. That's how wide of a range the smoke is. And I know here in Sacramento, where we are, since we're in the valley, the sky just turns black. The smoke just kind of gets trapped in here during that time. So even though we don't have fires impacting the schools directly, we have the smoke from the fires that impact the air quality, which impacts schools. So all of California is impacted by these fires every year. So these are all things that we have to consider when, preparing for disasters. Next slide. Here's a picture of the Oroville spillway incident. And so you can see the water just running like crazy out of here. And I'm not going to go too much over this since we've already kind of covered it, but this is the incident that really kicked off our partnership with Cal-OES. And since then, we kind of got our seat at the State Operations Center, which is called the SOC. We represent K through 12 education there, and we work with other partners too, including private schools and sometimes higher education as well. Next slide. And that's actually a picture of our seat over at the SOC. I'm sure that's going to change soon. They're always updating the SOC to have the most high-tech stuff available. This is kind of like the center of response for the state. So it's kind of the brain of response, I guess. So it's great being there and being able to work with our partners side by side, so that way we can really get things moving quickly. That's the whole point. Disasters happen fast, so response, you need to really kind of coordinate as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So on top of that, we also have what's called the Department Operations Center in our agency. And right now it's all virtual because of COVID, but basically it's kind of like a mini SOC, but it's just for education. So we have a bunch of subject matter experts within the agency who handle different aspects of education. So if a question comes up about nutrition or the J13A process or something like that, we have contacts within the agency that we can work with to kind of connect schools with those experts and get answers to them quickly. And next slide, please. So here's a picture of an elementary school playground in Greenville that we visited recently. And unfortunately, I've seen this multiple times a year in different playgrounds at different schools because of fires. But yeah, it's like even these playgrounds, they're expensive to replace, and kids need these outdoor facilities. So it could be really expensive to replace any facility. As I said, millions, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars to replace facilities and structures. So to help with that, there are many funding opportunities, and I won't go into OPSC's funding too much because I know they'll talk about it later, but there are some other programs that they have where you can utilize them to obtain funding. But the feds also have some funding that's available, and I want to share some of those with you as well. So one of them is the Public Assistance Program called the PA grant, which is a Fema grant. It's administered on the state level by Cal-OES. So what we can do, that's a program I came from. So I am more than happy to talk to anyone who's interested in this. But what this program does, it's for restoring public facilities back to their pre-disaster condition. And you can also implement mitigation measures in it as well, even though it's not specifically a mitigation grant. They're like, hey, if you're going to rebuild it better. So that way it doesn't get impacted as badly or at all, by the next time this disaster happens. I want to refer to the Papa G, that's their public assistance. I can't remember the full name, but it's a guide. It's their manual for the program. It's over 100 pages. So if you're having trouble sleeping at night, this is a great thing to help you with that. But it's very informative, though. It really kind of shows you what's allowable in the grant and what are the things you need to know about, about collecting information so that way you're eligible. What's a lot, and it's a lot about eligibility and allowability. I'm not going to go into it because that's a lot of information, and there's whole workshops about that. But I just want to let you know it's out there. If you're interested, just look up Papa G Fema, the PAPPG right there, and you should get all the information you ever wanted to know and more. And then in addition here, this grant is for school districts in counties that have been impacted by federally declared disasters. So that's really important to note. So if your county is not in that federally declared county or area where that federal disaster happened, then you cannot apply for this grant. But that doesn't mean you're out of luck. There still are other funding sources. So typically this grant covers about 75% of the total project cost. And so that way you have a 25% cost share to manage. I know for the more recent disasters, though, because they were so big, the fires were so big and so widespread, FEMA actually upped it to 90%. So that doesn't happen very often, but it did recently for the previous ones, which is great for those who have been impacted. So that's going to cover their costs a lot more. And then to follow up with that, there's the California Disaster Assistance Act. So this is the state version of this public assistance grant. So public assistance is federal, CDAA is state funded, and it does kind of the same stuff. It also funds at 75% of the total project cost. But the good part about this is if you're applying for public assistance, they will enroll you in the CDAA funding as well. So that means that 75% that you would get from CDAA will take care of, a portion of your match. So that way you're only paying like 6.25% of the total project cost, while these two grants manage the rest. Now, of course, these are both after insurance. Insurance does take care of whatever they can take care of first, and then what's remaining is what these projects can take care of. So the difference between CDAA and PA, though, is that CDAA is for school districts and counties impacted by disasters in California, not just federal events. So, so these are state funds. They're a little easier to apply to. They don't have as many strings attached. And I will be honest, these grants can be very difficult and paper heavy. So if you do not have a dedicated grant specialist that works at your district or your COE, then it's, that may be something you want to consider, getting someone, if your school is impacted, is to assign someone at least, part-time of their job to do something like this, because it does take a lot of time and a lot of paperwork to, get it done correctly. So I just want to put that up there, up front as a disclaimer. It's not going to be an easy walk in the park to get this, but it's totally worth it in the end when you're talking about tens of millions of dollars. All right, next slide. All right, so This next grant I want to talk about is also a federal grant. It's not through FEMA, though. It's through Department of Ed, the Disaster Response Unit specifically. This is called the Project School Emergency Response to Violence, or Project SERVE for short. So in this is not for brick and mortar costs like the other grants were that I just mentioned. This is more for, anything that's not brick and mortar, like staff costs. And it's just to restore the learning environment back to the way it was and make sure that you have that safety and security in your school environment. And this is not an extensive list. These are just some of the common things that I've seen in this grant. They provide mental health or funding for mental health services that are related to the event, overtime for staff for cleanup, substitutes, technical assistance for crisis response. And this is a big one, transportation for operating schools in alternate locations. So this happens quite a bit when a school has to, go to an alternate location, and then they still got to transport these students, from their homes to school. And it's an additional, however many miles, how much more time for, the driver. And that additional time, those additional miles can be charged to this grant. So that way you don't have to worry about all that additional stuff, the additional cost. The great thing about this is that it is direct from the feds to LEAs. There's no state in the middle of this. So that's one less person in the middle, plus it's 100% federally funded. So there's no match required in this. So this is probably one of the easiest grants I've seen to apply for and to manage. So there's no reason not to take advantage of this. You do have to be in an area of a federal declaration, just like in the PA grant. So that's the only thing, the qualifier I want to point out right now. Next slide. The final grant I want to talk about here is the Hazard Mitigation Grant. This is also administered through Cal-OES on the state level, but it is a FEMA grant as well. So lots of rules attached to it. Definitely a longer process to get this done. This isn't really a recovery grant. This is more of a mitigation grant, as the name implies, meaning that it's supposed to reduce the loss of life and property from future disasters. I put some examples on here. These are really common ones for schools, but this is not an exhaustive list. So like hazardous fuels reduction and creating defensible space kind of go hand in hand. If you do these two things around your school, you're much, much less likely to have fire damage when there is a big fire in your area. Also flood risk reduction. If you're in an area that floods a lot, there are things to do for that. Seismic risk. I mean, that's a big thing in California. I know they already have a big program for that for, residential houses, but you can also do this for schools as well. Retrofit, you can seismically retrofit the school. And also critical facility generators. I know schools have asked for generators over and over again, and there's not a lot of resources, but here is a resource. Unfortunately, there is a lot of competition in this grant for generators because you're competing with hospitals and all that. So the hospitals tend to have a pretty good justification for needing generators, since people will die if they have no power. But if you can have a benefit cost analysis, that shows that, hey, no, our generator is critical. We definitely need it for a school. That this is a great place for you to go through. And one of the most important things, and I should put this at the top, is the local hazard mitigation plan. So if you do not have a local hazard mitigation plan for your district or for your county, or you're not part of that anyway, then here's your opportunity. They will fund up to $150,000 for you to develop a local hazard mitigation plan, or $250,000 if it's a multi-jurisdictional, meaning like the county office does it for all the districts. And this is great because it shows you the hazards in your area and kind of addresses, how do you take care of that hazard? How do you mitigate that hazard in the future? And then you can choose to act on it at that point. And then you could do all these other projects that I talked about now that you know what your risks are. So an example of a project is just over here on the left. This isn't in California, but it's in one of our neighboring states. It's it's an elementary school that's been kind of retrofitted for earthquake and also for tsunami. So they put a flat roof over the gym to accommodate 1,000 people up there. So it could be students or community members, but it's like a community, or it's a tsunami safe zone that you would go to during a tsunami event. So that's obviously going to mitigate the loss of life during an event like that. And that's number one, what you want to do. And the earthquake will mitigate the loss of property, so that way the building doesn't fall down and become structurally unstable. So anyway, that's just an example of something you can do for schools. But I know here in California, the fires are a big concern since they happen over and over again. So maybe those hazardous fuels reduction and defensible space would be better options for many schools. Next slide. One thing I do want to share with you today is about the school emergency reporting system that we call SERS. So what this system is, we realized there was a gap in communication between the local level, meaning the schools and LEAs, and the state, where sometimes we didn't find out about things until, maybe a day later, sometimes 2 days later, like we'd find out in the mail, or someone would just kind of casually bring it up and be like, whoa, we had no idea there was a fire down in Orange County that impacted a school facility. It's like, what can we do to help? And by then it's days later, and we may not be able to help as much as we could have that same day. And by help, I mean find resources, kind of coordinate resources. So that's kind of what we do here, is that once we know there is an unmet need on your level, we can coordinate those resources with our state and federal and local partners too, to make sure you get those resources as quickly as possible. So this system allows us to do that. We developed a system where it's a really easy way for LEAs directly, like school districts, to directly report straight up to CDE and just kind of let us know, hey, we're impacted by this event, whatever it is, a fire, and this is our unmet need. And it's super simple. They just hit submit, it goes off to us. We see that come in and we start acting on it right away. So also we're able to kind of reach out as well and say, hey, we see that you guys are in a fire area. Are you impacted? And then they can just answer yes or no, and then answer follow-up questions if they answer yes. So we made it intentionally super easy, because we know during that time, it's super stressful. There's a lot going on, and we don't want to prevent, school districts from doing what they got to do for health and safety at that point. But at the same time, we also want to provide resources as quickly as possible. So anyway, this system has been live since September. So it's not quite a year old yet, so it's still pretty new, and we're doing training and testing on it, just trying to get all the school districts involved. But if you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out to me about it. Next slide. So I just want to end with some tips here. And these are all tips that we've actually heard from, other COEs and other districts. I think Tad actually said a couple of these today. So I just want to start with top one: know your facilities and where your utility shutoffs are located. On the left here is a picture of an automatic gas shutoff valve. So this, in case there's an earthquake or something, this thing will detect it and automatically shut off the gas, so there's no like gas explosions or anything like that at the school. So this is a great mitigation measure right here, but it's something that you need to know, like if it's even in your facility, or if it's right for your facility. And I would say yes, it's right for your facility. But there are a lot of things you can do, and you got to test on this kind of stuff too, or train on it. I mean, so that way you're familiar with how the system works, how to reset it, and all that kind of stuff. So know your facilities, know where your shutoffs are. That's super important. Also, something I can't emphasize enough is the backup important files through a cloud-based service. So why cloud-based service? That's because sometimes, these 37 facilities have been damaged or destroyed, in the past, few years. They can't go back to their documents. They can't get the stuff they need to kind of, show the grades for this, the kids, or personnel documents for the staff, or even, stuff they need for insurance, like, the facility inventory or the photos they have of their facility. It's great if you keep all that, but if you don't have access to it after the disaster, it's going to be a problem. So the cloud-based service, really important. I really recommend it. It's not like a requirement or anything, but it's definitely a best practice that I recommend to have those available, because your insurance is going to want to see those like almost right after the disaster. So that way you can get the recovery process going. Also, it helps you keep your school running, which is great as well. The next one I just kind of hit on is to keep the facility inventory with photos. I do this for my own house. So yeah, do it for your school too. I've seen it multiple times where, especially with insurance and FEMA grants, is that they are sticklers about documentation. They're not charities. So, if you do not have the documentation to show that what you have is actually in the condition you're saying it was, and that you have, photos of all of it proving that, they're going to err on the side of, not paying you. So I hate to say that, but that's the way it is. They're not a charity. They won't give you anything without the documentation to support that. So keep your documentation, keep it current, have some kind of facility inventory and tracking system, know what's in each of those facilities as well, which can be a daunting process, but it's going to be worth it in case a disaster hits. All right, and then also have contact information for your local emergency management and insurance provider. So if you're on the run from a fire or whatever, make sure you have those phone numbers with you. It's not in some Rolodex at your office or something, because if it is, you're going to have a rough time trying to get a hold of them. I mean, it may not be too bad for the insurance provider, but for your contact information for local emergency management, they're super important to get a hold of, because locally they may have the resources you need right then and there. They can get it to you within like minutes or hours, depending how far you are. That's the level you want to start on, is the local level. So make sure you're tied in with your local emergency management. And if whatever your request is exceeds their capacity, they'll take it up to the regional and then the state level, and then eventually the federal level if it has to go that high. And then finally, know what's in your comprehensive school safety plan. This is really important. It's a requirement for all schools to have anyway. So with this comprehensive school safety plan, they contain all sorts of useful information, like, what to do in certain types of disaster. I think Tad and Tom both mentioned that, they knew what to do during the fire for the evacuation because they already had plans for it. So that's what your school comprehensive safety plan contains in it. Plus, there are some recommendations, that you have a continuity of operations plan too, because if your school is shut down for a certain period of time, for a month or whatever, after a fire has gone through and maybe damaged it, but not destroyed it or whatever, you may not be able to go back to the campus for a while. What are you going to do in the meantime? These kids still need, they still need education. You still need to, house them somewhere. So have some kind of continuity of operations plan. Where do you go? What's your backup plan in case you can't go to that campus again? Also, know who your local first responders are, not just the emergency management person, but who's your law enforcement contact, who's your fire contact. And if there's any other emergency responders in your area, then know what their information is too. And work with them on a regular basis, especially when developing that comprehensive school safety plan, because they'll have valuable feedback that you may not consider, because it's their job to know what they know in that subject matter. And with that, I can talk all day about tips and tricks, but I want to leave some time for Nick. So I'm going to turn it over to Cal-OES. Nick.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Next slide, please. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the role of emergency management in schools. We're going to cover essentially down there at the bottom, you'll see where it says coming soon, our California emergency management for schools. That document is hopefully going to be released in the next couple of months, but everything that we're going to talk about is also covered in that document. And it basically is a way to integrate emergency management into your comprehensive school safety plans as we move forward. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So in the emergency management world, we have 4 phases, and they are very cyclical, as you can see there in the photo. We start with mitigation, right? Identifying all those hazards. Then we move to preparedness, which is kind of your planning and preparedness phase, where it's now we understand what our risks are. This is what we're going to do to make sure that we are ready for the disaster when it happens. Response, exactly what happens, right? The disaster kicks off, and we go right into taking out that plan, using it for what we need to. Taking care of students, evacuating the schools as necessary. That's your response phase. And then finally, recovery, which is, all right, so the disaster is over. What are we doing to either rebuild our facility, reoccupy our facilities? What are all those different recovery steps in there? So over the next few slides, we're going to talk about how all of that can be integrated into schools, understanding that it all comes from the original 4 phases of emergency management. Next slide, please. So first off, in that hazard mitigation piece, right, that is where we are identifying those hazards. Cal-OES sponsors a really good tool called My Hazards. In the presentation that you all received in the email, you can click that link and it'll take you right to it. You pop in your address, zip code, or even just your local area, depending on what you want to know. And it'll tell you all the different types of risks that your area, that your either facility, home, resident, whatever it is nearby. So that includes earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, tsunami hazards, those types of things. So the most common ones that we're going to see there. From that particular piece, it gives you that opportunity to see and automatically understand what you need to prepare for in the long run. So that puts us back into, as we mentioned earlier, that local hazard mitigation plan. Almost every county has a local hazard mitigation plan. It's generally something that you're going to find on your county Office of Emergency Services webpage, and you can download it, take a look at it, and see what different things that they're preparing for at the end of the day. This tool is a part and parcel for all of it, so it helps you really understand what your risks are. One of the other most important things that we always talk about is This goes not only just to your facility preparedness, but as well as individual preparedness, is making sure that you're signed up for emergency alerts. So the Cal-OES is a sponsored program through Cal-OES that puts you in touch with all 58 counties. So you just go and figure out, you go to your specific county and sign up for alerts right away. That can be everything from email alerts, SMS text messaging alerts, phone calls, and so forth. So it's definitely one of those things. Know your risks and make sure that you have the alerts, right? So again, so you are as best prepared as possible as you deal with the disaster as it comes. And as I said earlier, review your hazard mitigation plan if your county has one. As Joe mentioned earlier, if you have the ability to get your own, even better, because then you can drill down into those specific risks that affect your school/facility. Next slide, please. So as we move on, this next program I'm going to talk about is think of it as a hazard mitigation program as well. But it focuses more on the active shooter, active intruder concept. So the State Threat Assessment Center sponsors what we call our School Facilities Vulnerability Assessment Program. And that is targeted for law enforcement, school resource officer, and school administrators, or anybody within the district or COE that has some sort of tie-in to security for the facilities. And what they use is what we call CPTED, which is Crime Prevention through Environmental Design. So this course is generally an 8 to 16 hour course, and it'll teach those particular folks what to look for when trying to harden their facility against any sort of active shooter, active intruder threat that may be there in the long run. I know that DSA has a piece to this as well, and they have a 2018 document that talks a little bit about the specific types of blocks and barricades that are approved for schools. And definitely one of those things where you want to make sure you have that information available as well if you're going to be going through this type of training or these types of hardening aspects for your school. Next slide, please. So as we move into planning or preparedness from the hazard mitigation piece, this is where we are bringing in all of our community partners, right? That's your parent teachers associations, your students, right? Students have a piece of preparedness as well because they're going to have certain roles to fulfill, or you may want to incorporate them as part of your emergency response, depending on their age and ability. This also includes all of your internal and external stakeholders, right? So when we look at that, we're going to talk about it in the next couple of slides, but what we're talking about is including your first responders, your district, your county, and anybody else that has a piece of this particular planning function. And as you develop that emergency operations plan, because that's ultimately what we hope that you guys do, that emergency operations plan will complement / supplement your comprehensive school safety plan. And as we talk about utilizing the standardized emergency management system, which is the system we use here in California, we hope to integrate that with all of your comprehensive school safety plans. And one of the big pieces of that is once you've got your partners together and you've developed your emergency operations plan, the next piece of it is to train the staff and exercise that plan. So down below, as you see here, I've listed 3 pretty good resources that are all for the most part free, and you can take advantage of them today if you need to. Which cover various different types of topics. So our CSTI, or California Specialized Training Institute, covers all of the basics of Sems, the basics of emergency management with free online courses. For SROs, there is officer safety and tactics, and they also have human trafficking and a terrorism liaison course. So there's all sorts of different things that take place that they have with different eligibilities depending on what you're trying to take advantage of. Some of you, or a lot of you, hopefully have heard of the Rems TA Center, which is the Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools Technical Assistance Center. They have a ton of guides and a ton of tools and resources that can help you develop high-quality emergency operations plans. And that is a federal resource that you can take advantage of today. And then lastly, the FEMA's Emergency Management Institute, they have a school program, or a school track, as we like to call it, that has specific online coursework that focuses on schools, students, first aid, those types of things. And those are all free online courses. The only requirement is that you create a FEMA student ID, which is free, and you can be able to take advantage of those courses right away. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk a little bit about the standardized emergency management system. That's the system we use here in the state of California. And the most important thing about that system is that all emergencies start and finish local. So they may start down at the county level, and they'll work their way all the way up to the federal level. And then as the disaster goes away, becomes smaller, more manageable, or it gets to the point where for example, a wildfire is no longer burning. And now we've transitioned to that recovery phase. It will then slowly go back down to the local level where finally it will end and reside there. So it's a scalable concept that we bring to the table. And so it incorporates a couple of different concepts, right? So first is that incident command system. How do we organize ourselves? How do we organize our staff to mitigate or deal with this particular disaster? Incorporates mutual agency coordination, mutual aid, right? So how do we all work together? So how does the County Office of Education work with the County Office of Emergency Services, the county fire, local law enforcement, so forth? So how do they all work together? And this is what Sems looks to do, is as that incident grows, it brings all of the correct partners to the table to work and help hopefully deal with that disaster effectively and quickly. And then the last kind of piece to it is the operational area concept. So that is what we call the geographical boundaries of the county. So for the state of California and Cal-OES, there's 58 counties, which is very, I don't want to say easy for us to manage, but it's a lot easier to manage than roughly 10,000 schools and over 1,100 school districts. And so for when we look at how we deal with disasters, we're looking at what is that actionable unit. That actionable unit for the state is the counties. And so we will work with those 58 counties for various administrative and mutual aid regions in supporting them throughout their disaster. And on the left-hand side, I realize it does say the Cal-OES Yellow Book. It's no longer yellow. They've made it a white document. But it used to be a yellow page, yellow covered document. The point of that document is that it covers all of the emergency laws that affect the standardized emergency management system that we use here in California. Next slide, please. So here's our Sems organizational level. So on the left is what the state generally works with. And then on the right is how Sems can be incorporated into schools and to kind of see where you all may fall in within that kind of chain of authority as we go forward. So as you can see, the state is right there up next to FEMA. We have our OES regions. There's 3 administrative regions. There's 6 mutual aid regions. And then it gets larger as it goes down the line. We get to that operational area, as I mentioned before, and that's the counties, your local government. Those are your agencies or your cities within the county. And your field/ICS level, that's exactly where the fire or earthquake or whatever the disaster is, that's where that kind of takes place. And the local responders dealing with that. When we transition over to when we're looking at how it can affect schools, right? Schools and sites, that's at the bottom of the totem pole. But that doesn't mean that they don't have high priority. It just means that there's a lot of bureaucracy kind of between us and you all. But what we're trying to do with this particular slide is highlight to all of our school representatives here that you will work hopefully through your school districts, your county office of education, local government, all the way up to that operational area. So when it says resource requests go up and resources go down, as Tad and Tom mentioned earlier, those are your unmet needs. If you have issues that can't be solved at your level, then you move them up the chain. And ultimately, some things will make it to the state, some things will make it to the Fed. And so the plan, and at least the way that it's supposed to operate, all of your resource requests will work up that chain to be fulfilled as they go back down. And so everybody is looking out for the next level below them to take care of their unmet needs as they deal with the disaster going forward. Next slide, please. So one of our kind of preparedness products that we wanted to talk about today as well is the Cal-OES Preparedness Ambassadors Program. It's the first statewide 4th grade preparedness program, and it can be adapted for virtual learning and as well as other grade levels. So we've seen it as far down as 2nd grade, and we've seen it as far up as 8th grade at this point. Currently, it's I believe it's serving about 60 different schools and about 800 to 900 students. I can't remember the number off the top of my head. But what it is it's a disaster preparedness program that covers the 7 most prolific disasters we face here in California, with emphasis on California-based disasters. There's some that we don't really deal with as well as other states or other countries have, so we wanted to incorporate those as well. But the most important thing is it's a way to help bring preparedness to the community through the students. And so when they complete the program, they're now dubbed a preparedness ambassador. And with the program, they have the ability to request for little cinch backpacks, magnets, bookmarks, stickers, and so forth to help really promote the program. Ultimately, once they complete it and they're dubbed the Preparedness Ambassador, they have what we call the Family Readiness Guide. You see that there in the middle. That Family Readiness Guide is about a 20-page document, and it covers all different facets of individual/family preparedness. So everything from your medical information to your pet information, your communications plan, ways to escape your home or domicile. So it covers all sorts of different things that you should at least have ready to go, prepared and to deal with a disaster if it hits you at the home level. So this is a program, again, it's free, no registration is required. You can just reach out to Danielle or myself, and we will help you guys out with acquiring the materials for that program. And lastly, the Family Readiness Guide is in 6 different languages, excluding English. So it covers, we have it in Spanish, Korean, Tagalog, and 2 different Chinese languages, and then there's Vietnamese as well. And so these are all available free for download, and you can take advantage of it today. Next slide, please. So lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about recovery and response to recovery. As I mentioned earlier, response is where you put all of those kind of preparedness efforts into play. That you're activating your emergency plan, you're putting together your team, everybody is coming to the table, and you're dealing with that disaster, whatever it may be. That's going to incorporate, all of the different sub teams to that. So if you have an evacuation team at your school, or you have a logistics team at your school, all of those players are coming to the table and working together to get your school or site or district through that disaster. And that also incorporates, the coordination with the law enforcement, fire, EMS, and all the other partners that you need to have throughout this particular process. The most important thing out of the response, aside from obviously life safety, is going to be tracking those costs. So Tad and Tom kind of mentioned that earlier. It is definitely a huge, time saver in the long run when it comes to the recovery process of tracking those costs. Everything from staff time, procurement, anything that was purchased to help you guys deal with the disaster, all the extra overtime that might have been involved. Track all of those costs. Make sure there's somebody dedicated or a team of people dedicated to tracking those costs, because ultimately you want to be reimbursed for all those things after the disaster is over. As you move into that recovery phase, the response is usually pretty quick, and then when you get to that recovery phase, it can take anywhere from days, weeks, months, even years. For example, here at Cal-OES, we have recently closed out some of the earthquake stuff from the Northridge earthquakes back in the 90s. So that just gives you an idea of how long the impacts and the recovery process can be for some of these disasters. Ultimately, when you're going through recovery, this is your chance to make sure that you're getting reimbursed, you're working with your state partners, you're working with your county partners, and you're also having a chance to take that first breath of relief that, hey, this disaster is over, now it's time for us to rebuild, and time to review how well all of our plans worked. That AAR process, the after action review, is huge. It helps you really understand where your shortcomings were, where you excelled during the disaster, and move forward from there. It gives you an opportunity to take all those lessons learned and refine your emergency plan. And lastly, and this is something that we have seen in many different school districts across the state that have had to deal with disasters, is making sure that you plan for that psychological and emotional recovery. So that means having crisis counselors on hand, bringing in other school counselors to help talk with the students and make sure that they have emotionally not necessarily recovered, but they're doing good and they're able to move forward. Last year, I heard some very good information regarding the COVID-19 recovery. That's something that we're in the process of now. Is that you had students that were gone for a year from school, doing everything virtually. And so the next, big crisis is going to be the emotional health of the students as they return to the campus. So it's definitely one of those things that you want to prepare and be ready to deal with as students come back to school. The last thing I want to add, and I just want to make sure that I'm piggybacking off of all the other panelists and everybody else who has spoken, build those relationships with your partners. If you haven't done so already, start doing it now. So you know who the people are that are going to come to help you out during that disaster and before that disaster as well. So make sure you have those, build depth within your teams. but most importantly, build those relationships so that you're ready for that next disaster. Next slide, please. So here's our contact information. Again, if you guys ever have any questions in regards to disasters, disaster management, emergency management, and how Cal-OES and the Department of Education can support you guys through that, take down our information, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to help as we go forward. Joe, is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, nothing. I just wanted to thank all of our partners for, working with us and, supporting schools throughout this effort, because it is a massive effort and it takes years and years to really recover after some of these disasters. So we really do appreciate the partnerships that we have here today. So thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you, everybody. So at this point, I'll pause here and we can go to the next slide, which is for DSA. And if there's any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat and we'll be sure to answer them. Thank you for your time. Ida, it's all yours.
Thank you, Nick. Well, thanks all of you for being here today. DSA is happy to work with Cal-OES, OPSC, and CDE in bringing this presentation to you. I am Ida Claire. I am the state architect. I'm joined here today with Harlan Raymont, who's the manager of the Sacramento Regional Office, Doug Humphrey, who's the manager of Los Angeles Regional Office, Dessa Rooney, who's the manager of the Oakland Regional Office, and Eric Dreber, who's the principal architect in headquarters. Craig Rush, who is the manager of San Diego Regional Office, was unable to join us today, but all of us are here and willing and ready to serve you in an emergency. Next slide, please. A bit of a reminder, we are in 4 regions. DSA is here to serve you locally. And so please check the statewide map to determine who your regional office is, and our contact information is on our website. Next slide, please. Remember that all construction on your sites needs to come through DSA. There are a few exceptions, but you should reach out to us and ensure that your project is proceeding in a code-compliant manner by our plan review and approval and our design and construction oversight. Next slide, please. And it's very important that you meet with us. We are available to meet with you at any time. You can request a meeting with our forms that are on the website. Of course, if it's an emergency, you can just reach out with a phone call to the regional manager of your local office. But in planning your projects, we ask that you get us involved early. That's the best result that you can have for any of your projects and to streamline the process. At project planning, at schematic design, any single time that you need to meet with us, we are here. You just need to make the request. Next slide, please. At this time, I'm going to pass it to Harlan Raymont, who's the Sacramento Regional Office, and they will discuss the emergency process at DSA. Harlan?
Yes, hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today's workshop. Regardless of the size of the event or disaster, your first step should be to contact the local jurisdiction that is responding to the disaster. This will typically be the Office of Emergency Services, the local sheriff, or the local fire department. They will be able to direct you to the immediate steps that you need to take to secure your facilities while formulating a plan for recovery. As Tom and Tad discussed earlier, your next step should be to contact your local county office of education in order to coordinate your efforts between your facilities and others in the area. When cleared by the local jurisdiction and the county office of education, call your local DSA regional office for assistance. Depending on the type of disaster, DSA would then be able to initiate a response. Our field engineers may be able to determine the extent of damage and whether or not your buildings are safe to enter or occupy. If you have buildings that are unsafe to enter or occupy, you will likely begin to explore the use of interim housing during your recovery effort. DSA can help you begin the planning process for the interim housing, as well as the repair or replacement of your damaged facilities. Next slide, please. Of course, nobody can see into the future to determine exactly what will happen or when it will occur. So the best practice is to be prepared. Have an emergency plan for different types of emergency scenarios, such as wildfires, earthquakes, active shooters, or tsunamis in coastal regions. To prepare for fires, you should have a coordinated plan with neighboring districts to accommodate your student population during an evacuation or ongoing recovery efforts. As a result of the Camp Fire in 2018, which wiped out the towns of Paradise and Magalia, the entire area was evacuated for several weeks. The school district worked with school officials in nearby Chico and Oroville to set up temporary facilities to house students and provide services while firefighters continue to fight the wildfire, mop up, and evaluate the damage. For earthquakes, preparations can include evaluating your facilities to make sure that potential hazards can be minimized. This means securing furniture such as bookshelves and media cabinets or other movable objects to structural elements of the building. For active shooter situations, your preparations should consider the need to shelter in place or to quickly evacuate your facilities depending on the situation. For tsunamis and floods, practice evacuation plans and drills. Make sure that staff and faculty know what to do and where to go to report. Recently, as a result of safety power shutoffs, DSA has seen many standby generator projects. Remember that these standby generators need to be submitted to DSA for review and approval before installation. Next slide, please. Please refer to the DSA website for our guidance document, Emergency Preparedness and Classroom Security. It can be found under the Resources tab and then under the Fire and Life Safety Plan Review tab. In this publication, you will find suggestions on how to establish an emergency preparedness plan and also a description of security hardware for classrooms and other spaces within your buildings that meet the minimum code requirements and allow for sheltering in place while still permitting egress. Before making any changes to the hardware in your building, please consult with DSA, as there are many types of hardware on the market today, but only some are appropriate for security use in your facility. Next slide, please. In light of recent wildfires and the continuing severity of the fire seasons, several items have been codified in the California Building Code and California Fire Code to strengthen buildings and facilities to withstand the impacts of wildfire. In Chapter 7, the California Building Code will require building owners to maintain an inventory of all fire resistance rated construction and construction installed to resist the passage of burning embers, smoke, and hot gases. These are items such as fire-resistant roofing and building siding, screens over rain gutters, and at eave and attic vents. The code also requires annual inspection of these building elements and will be enforced by your local fire authority. Roofs should also be inspected and cleared of debris buildup such as leaves and pine needles on a regular basis. Chapter 49 of the California Fire Code has special requirements for wildland urban interface areas. New landscape materials in these areas must be of a fire-resistant nature. Plant materials must be maintained as they mature so that they will not add to the fuel load. The new provisions were approved by the Building Standards Commission in December of 2021 and have an effective date of January 1st, 2023. The link at the bottom of this slide will take you to the code language that will appear in the next issue of the Building Code. Remember, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to your local DSA regional office. We are here to help you with all of your construction needs. And with that, I will pass it off to Eric Dreber.
Thank you very much, Harlan. Good morning, everybody. And again, I'd like everybody else, I'd really like to thank you for your attendance today. Very important topic. That California certainly has been greatly affected by emergencies in the recent past. Again, my name is Eric Dreber. I'm the principal architect for DSA headquarters, responsible for the architectural codes and policies at DSA. My responsibilities include oversight of the fire life safety at schools, accessibility, sustainability, and our CAS program. So while fire life safety certainly is critical to emergencies, what I'm here to talk to you today primarily about is accessibility of emergency and temporary shelters. Over the last several years, I have, as most of you have experienced some form of emergency or emergency response. I'm safe to say that no one in California really has escaped in some form or fashion without being affected by some emergency. As my duties as an architect of record for a number of emergency facilities over the past years, I've observed during those moments that accessibility requirements are often thought to be waived or in some way less stringent during an emergency response. And so my singular point that I'd like to really drive home today is to correct that narrative and show you some of the reasons why and ways that we can plan for accessibility in these emergency and temporary facilities. I'd also, along those same lines, like to echo the sentiment that DSA really is not here as a barrier to your success or to providing emergency response to your students and faculty. We're here to help. And part of our involvement here today is to start that discussion. We are always willing to take the phone call and help you plan. So let's start with the assumption of a lessened or waived accessibility provision in your emergency response. And I like to ask three questions, and that is, are persons with disabilities, are persons with disabilities jointly affected by emergencies? The answer would be yes. Is there a greater potential for a larger number of disabled folks during an emergency? Most likely, yes. And thirdly, is a person with a disability potentially at greater risk during an emergency? Also, again, yes. So based upon that line of reasoning, why would one assume that the accessibility requirements should be less stringent or worse waived? So to focus on this point, and in front of you, looks like some of the slides gotten clipped in some way, but I want to go over a few of the regulatory and legal reasons that accessibility is required. And certainly they aren't limited to state laws. It was mentioned earlier that the Field Act was waived, and DSA was a part of that discussion with the school district. But not all laws are state laws. There are federal laws at play, and so I'll go over those as well. But let's start with the state requirements. In Chapter 1 of the California Building Code, the administrative portion of it, Section 1.9.1 states that the purpose of the code is to ensure that barrier-free design is incorporated in all buildings, facilities, site work, or other improvements to which this code applies in compliance with state law to ensure that these improvements are accessible to and usable by persons with disabilities. Additions, alterations, structural repairs in all buildings and facilities shall comply with these provisions for new buildings except as otherwise provided. The second paragraph to that is probably the meat to our discussion today, and it says the provisions of these regulations, meaning the California Building Code, shall apply to any portable buildings leased or owned by school district and shall also apply to temporary and emergency buildings and facilities. Temporary buildings and facilities are not a permanent construction, but are extensively used or are essential for public use for a period of time. So clearly, the implication there, the requirement there is that the building code during times of emergency and for temporary use still applies in its full extent. Next slide. So I mentioned I'm sorry, can you go back one slide, please? Jumping ahead, I read for you the requirements in the administrative portion, but Chapter 11B is the section of the building code that specifically deals with accessibility in public accommodations, meaning any privately funded accommodations are required to be compliant with Chapter 11B, but also, of course, schools and publicly funded public accommodations. And so Chapter or Section 11B 201.3 distinctly states temporary and permanent structures. For temporary and permanent structures, these requirements, meaning CBC Chapter 11B, shall apply to temporary and permanent buildings and facilities. So those requirements both are very clear to the intent of the code. Okay, now we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So I mentioned that there are federal requirements as well, and I'm sure that comes as no surprise to everybody, and you're very familiar with the ADA, I'm sure. But the CBC Chapter 11B, in terms of chapter organization, is aligned with the ADA accessible guidelines. And so you'll note that under the ADA, it is section, instead of 11B 201.3, it is simply Chapter 201.3, and is titled, again, Temporary and Permanent Structures. This is our model code for Chapter 11B. And so the language is exactly the same. And it says these requirements, meaning in this case, the ADA guidelines, these requirements shall apply to temporary and permanent buildings and facilities. So again, very straightforward. The advisory down below is an advisory from the Access Board, and simply expands upon some of the what seems to be a fairly straightforward statement, but there's always room for interpretation, and so they try to provide these advisories in some of their advisory manuals. Next slide. Program accessibility. So part of the ADA is broken up into 5 titles. I won't go into all of them, but suffice to say that state and local governments are covered under Title II of the ADA, and specifically Subpart D is the section that relates to program accessibility. And it's somewhat general in nature, the way it's written. However, it deals with persons with disabilities and the discrimination that's provided or prohibited, by the ADA, and simply states, except as otherwise provided in Section 35150, no qualified individual with a disability shall, because of a public entity's facilities are inaccessible to or usable by individuals' disabilities, be excluded from participation or be denied the benefits of public services, programs, or activities of a public entity, or shall be subjected to discrimination by a public entity. So that's just, again, a very overarching concept, and nothing that a public entity can do should be discriminatory towards persons with disability. Next slide. Further on in Title II, Section 35.151 states that social service center establishments, group homes, halfway houses, shelters, or similar social service establishments that provide either temporary sleeping accommodations or residential dwelling units that are subject to this section shall comply with the provisions of 2010 standards. So this deals more with sleeping, but certainly deals with public housing, which again would need to comply, if we're going back to state requirements in the California Building Code, would need to comply with Chapter 11B. Next slide, please. So those are just a few of the state and federal requirements. And so again, I want to stress that the state and all of our entities are required to comply with the federal requirements. And so while one might think that the state could waive state regulations, and that clearly has happened in the past, for instance, on specific instances, we do not have the authority to waive federal requirements. And these are federal requirements that you would also, that our client agencies and client districts would need to comply with. So how do we plan for emergencies? Well, certainly, I think it's been mentioned several times, so I won't go in depth with that, but certainly plan for alternate interim housing. And whether that's local or more broadly extended locations, obviously those in Paradise were affected locally and needed to use the resources available to them on a much broader area. And so plan for that, having a plan in place to partner with folks. It was mentioned to know the people around you and start making those connections. I would definitely reiterate that. In some instances, schools are used as a local resource. So have campus maps available that have accessible elements identified on them. Show where there might be accessible parking, where some of the other accessible elements are on campus, and have those identified for all of your campuses. They should include the accessible route to all the public elements, like entrances to facilities, if not all your entrances are accessible, parking, restrooms, beds or cots. And if there isn't a route to a particular temporary facility, consider alternate locations or provide some alternate temporary surfaces. Next slide, please. Should also make sure that you have the ability to provide an appropriate number of accessible elements. And by that, I mean, whether it's restroom facilities or the drinking fountains or whatever the particular public element is or facility is, provide an appropriate number. So if there isn't a particular standard for an item, general good rule of thumb is about 5% of those elements should be made to be accessible, like beds and cots. Those should include maneuvering clearances, as well as a 5-foot turning area adjacent to the bed. The provide door clearances at doors that are on the accessible route. And there are some recent additions to the CBC, California Building Code, that cover more specifically certain systems, such as variable messaging systems. CBC Chapter 11B, Section 216.13 states that where provided, emergency shelters conveying emergency information must comply with 11B 703.8. That's communication requirements, text height, and font style on your variable messaging systems. Those are all included in the building code, as well as ADA guidelines. If you were to refer to the ADA, it would be section 703.8. Next slide, please. So with that, I will turn it over to Dessa Rooney.
Thank you, Eric. I'm Dessa Rooney. I'm a principal architect and regional manager for the Oakland DSA office. And within my region, DSA Oakland has had the distinction of responding to fire disasters as well as earthquakes. And we also reside in a tsunami-generated flood hazard zone, as is much of the California coast. So I'm going to start out my discussion with talking about interim housing, which has been touched on a couple of times throughout the presentation. This is a key element in response to natural disasters and assisting local school districts in getting their facilities up and running. And DSA has an IR, interpretive regulation A-1, which provides for temporary school use of a DSA-approved relocatable building. And I believe it was talked about in the Paradise fire that they deployed temporary relocatable buildings out at the airport and at different locations in order to house students. So it really is a key function to getting schools back up and running. DSA offers an expedited process in the event of natural disasters. And what we require is that a district reach out to the regional office, preferably the regional manager, notifying them of the emergency. And then within 14 days, then that allows the district to then order and place the relocatables without getting DSA approval, review and approval first. So they can then start their process. This is a 3-year temporary approval, and you can get that extended an additional 3 years if necessary. So within, again, 14 days of install, notify your local DSA regional office that you've placed the relos and how many you've placed. And then within the 60 days of the installation, the district needs to bring a project to the local DSA office for DSA review and approval. And that includes the fees and the review by fire, life safety, structural, and access. And there should also be coordination with OPSC and CDE on that also. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk about 2 lessons that have been learned from the Napa County experience. Napa as a county has experienced the earthquake back in 2014, and also in September of 2020 there was the Napa glass fire. Regarding the Napa earthquake, even though 70 buildings were red tagged, there were no red tag buildings through Napa Valley Unified School District. So they didn't sustain any major structural damage. But one of the things that that were determined to be problematic are non-structural component anchorage. And that's things like filing cabinets, bookcases, anything that's not attached during the course of that earthquake toppled. And I think there was a photograph I saw that showed a bookcase that had fallen in front of an exit door. So those are critical things that districts need to keep in mind when trying to plan for disasters such as an earthquake. Other things that were observed were heaved concrete sidewalks, suspended ceilings coming down, and some light fixtures. So again, these are all non-structural components, but that's not to say that they can't cause damage and harm to occupants who are in the process of exiting or are in the facility if an earthquake is to occur. I just wanted to read something from the Napa Valley Register. This was a quote back in 2014. School district leaders and architects said the most important place for the district to improve earthquake safety in the future may be to ensure that all bookshelves, cabinets, and fixtures are secured to walls to prevent their becoming roadblocks to escaping a room or building. So that was something that was identified. And when the earthquake occurred, DSA deployed district field engineers to go out and take a look at the buildings and assist the districts with that. So I wanted to touch on the Napa glass fire. There was significant financial damage as happens in all the fires that occur in California. 67 acres burned, 1,555 structures were destroyed, 70,000 people were evacuated or displaced. And what has come out of, I think, all the fires in California are stricter code provisions for the wildland urban interface. And I think that is probably going to continue to take place. Codes are probably going to get stricter and stricter regarding that, just because of all the cost that occurs as a result of that damage. And also, I wanted to make you aware that there's a California Administrative Code provision 4-309A exception. Under the exception, it allows for any fire damaged structure, school structure, the regulations and code standards in effect at the time of the original application may be used for the reconstruction work. So that's saying that structural drawings from the time the building was constructed can be utilized in the event of a fire, and that's only specified for fire. All right, thank you. Next slide, please. I wanted to just include these photographs just to show that these are examples of damage to non-school buildings. And I think it's important to note here that California schools and essential buildings within the state of California have sustained earthquakes pretty successfully. As I stated, for the Napa quake, we had pretty insignificant damage in terms of non-structural components sustaining coming down or sustaining damage. But you can see that a building that's not up to code, or an older building, or a building that's not part of the school inventory sustained significant damage during the Napa earthquake. Next slide, please. And these are just a couple examples of the Napa glass fire showing the extent of the damage on the map to the right. And actually the slide on the left is a residence, but it shows that some of the structure is remaining, but very little is still standing. And again, school buildings usually have done fairly well, although in the Paradise Fire, they lost all the structures. But in the Napa fire, I think there was some minor damage that occurred, and due to sprinklers and fire alarm systems and stuff like that. So, and with that, I will conclude and pass this on to Brian Lepask with OPSC.
Thank you, Dessa. Good morning. Brian Lepask with OPSC. I'm going to walk you through some of the basics of our facility hardship program, which may end up being a good option for you, getting your facilities back in working order with some of the funding that it can provide in coordination with maybe a few other sources. I know we've absorbed a lot of information today, but the overall message I wanted to communicate to you this morning was we have a team with a wealth of experience. And, you know, while you may have not been through our program before, we've done it lots of times. And we encourage you to reach out to us as quick as you can. You're going to have a lot to sort out, but the sooner we can get in contact with you when you do have the time, it will enable us to provide you the most simple and straightforward experience and process that you can have. And so that's kind of really what I wanted to get across, is that it's very doable and we're here to help you. Next slide, please. Facility hardship program can provide assistance to school districts. They're primarily for health and safety projects, and a lot of the work that we do with these projects could be for a lot of different things. It can be for something as simple as water damage, or mold, or that kind of mitigation. But primarily, when you have a natural disaster, you're going to be very easy to qualify for the program. And we also have hardship assistance that's available. So if you need hardship assistance for your funding, we can also provide you with that. Next slide, please. This is a minimum work program, and what that primarily means is that the work to mitigate the issue that you have to restore your buildings to kind of their pre-existing condition is what the program can do. We want to make sure that we are housing all the students that are at that site, and the program will always provide for that. In addition to that, if you have any sort of access compliance or other issues that require some funding, we're able to provide those too. And it would just be included as part of the minimum work in the program. You don't have to have eligibility aside from having an issue at your site. Typically, our programs require some sort of pupil grant eligibility. However, this program does not require that. It's just the existing health and safety risk, and then that's kind of the project. There may be some interaction with the other eligibility, but we can work with you on that and kind of figure that out. It really depends on each case. Next slide, please. So this program is featured as far as it's our top priority. We always make sure that facility hardship program projects are funded first. They go directly to the top of our workload list. Even in times where we do not have funding available, we still encourage people to submit them, because as soon as we do have authority back available again, they will be the first to be processed, and they have priority for bond fund allocation. If insurance proceeds are part of what you're receiving, they will be offset. 50% of what you receive from insurance will be offset from your facility hardship grant, but they can be used in conjunction with each other. And FEMA funding or any kind of federal funding can also be used in conjunction with the program. So it doesn't prohibit you from applying for our funds. We handle those on a case-by-case basis, and we kind of see how each one interacts with each project, but you can use them all together to provide replacement facilities. Next slide, please. So what are the different types of facility hardship applications? We essentially have 3 of them. There's a full school replacement where you have lost the entire school. And in that case, we will provide facilities for the enrollment that you have at that site. There's partial replacement or individual structures or buildings, and that's probably the most common thing we see, where there's a building or maybe a few buildings. In those cases, we fund those based on square footage. And so we have a square footage grant that we allocate, and that is what's provided for the replacement facilities. In cases where you're able to retain the facilities with just some rehabilitation, the costs to do the rehabilitation are what the grant will end up being. And we use a guide for that. We have a construction cost guide by Sierra West that's incorporated into our program by regulation. And that's what really drives the cost for rehabilitation. The rehabilitation estimates are important for all types of projects, because even if you're doing replacement, we have to do a cost benefit analysis of the rehabilitation costs compared to the replacement value of the building. And if it exceeds 50% of that amount, you will qualify for replacement funding, either on a full school replacement or building by building. And if it falls below that 50% amount, that will end up being your rehabilitation grant. For districts that qualify for financial hardship, we have design funding available too. So the idea of the design funding is it's an advance on your full grant, and it will enable you to kind of get the ball rolling and get those plans going. We also have conceptual approvals. I thought I'd mention that just for general projects. However, in cases where there's been a natural disaster, I don't really think that's really going to be needed. A conceptual approval is really just a concept, just kind of that exact words, concept. It's a concept or conceptual approval that the project qualifies. In cases of natural disasters, I think that's going to be pretty clear already, though. Next slide, please. Okay, so this looks at the matching share amount for the different types of projects. If you do qualify for financial hardship, you can receive up to 100%, and the state will pay for all your matching funds. Or if you have a partial amount, the state will pay for the balance of that. Replacement projects, either full school or just by building, are 50-50 state and district. And then for rehabilitation projects, they're funded on a 60-40 basis, with the state paying 60% of the eligible costs. Next slide. So I want to take a look at some of the essential documents. There's really 3 main documents, and these are the core of a facility hardship application and the things that you really want to get focused on. Just wanted to mention too that we have lots of examples of these. So if you're unsure what it should say exactly, or you wanted to see kind of what one looks like that's been accepted and successful in the program, we're happy to provide that to you or kind of walk you through them. I would say maybe the most important is the industry specialist report. And what this is going to be, and it depends on the issue, who the industry specialist can or should be. But this report is really the heart of the whole application, and it's going to tell us exactly what the issue is. It's going to have a description of that, and in pretty good detail about exactly what happened, why it's causing a health and safety threat, and then it's going to identify the root cause of it. Again, in natural disasters, this all might be very clear. However, you really want that report to be descriptive on exactly what the threat is and what caused it. And then the last piece of that would be to outline the measures that it would take to mitigate that threat. So that's the basis of our analysis of what we're going to provide funding for. And it's really going to guide us in our review and what we can allow. And the report doesn't necessarily have to talk about any of the triggers that would happen. So for instance, if you're replacing a building and it triggered access compliance work, the report doesn't need to talk about that, but it does need to talk about what would be needed to mitigate the building or the buildings that are in the project. Some of the typical industry specialists we see are plumbers, structural engineers, and electricians. However, it can be really anybody who has jurisdiction over the issue that's for that building. Next slide, please. Along with the report will come a governmental concurrence, and this is a third-party review of the proposed scope and of the report, and it really just says that it's an agreement or a concurrence with what's in the report and what the measures are. And it's that second level of verification, and it needs to come from a governmental agency. A lot of them will come from DSA if they're structural in nature, but it could be a health department, a fire marshal, or perhaps the California Geologic Survey if you have some sort of issue with your soils or with your kind of the ground underneath the buildings. So again, staff OPSC, we can work with you on that. We have a lot of examples of what those say and who's appropriate depending on the type of project you have. Next slide. This last piece, I would call this the three most important pieces as a cost estimate. And again, this is used in two different ways, at least one and sometimes two different ways. We always use this for a cost-benefit analysis to determine if you're eligible for replacement funding or rehabilitation funding. Again, we do a comparison of what the minimum mitigation costs are in that estimate compared to the replacement value of the building. And if it exceeds 50%, you qualify for replacement funding. If it's under 50%, the items that are in that estimate will be your rehab grant. So it's a really important thing to get accurate. You want to make sure you get everything in there and that the items that you are requesting are able to be verified in your plans. We have a form for this, and so there's a template that's ready to use. You just plug values in. We try to make it as easy as possible to complete the estimate, and we're able to go over that with you too if you have any questions about that form. Next slide. So in addition to this information that I just talked about, we have a website with a lot of different resources on it. And we have even some videos that we've done. There's a couple links there. There's a lot more things at that website other than just that video or a few links. There's really a lot of information there. And again, we're only a phone call or an email away. Our contact information is on the next slide. And we're always able to help you through all these, the last thing you want to worry about is all the details. We're here to help you with the details and to make sure that you have a successful application. So please use this as a resource. We are always available to have meetings or calls or send you information, and we're more than happy to help. So please utilize that. So that concludes the OPSC presentation. I think at this point, we're going to open it up to questions and answers. And so if you have anything that you'd like to ask any of the agencies, now is a great time to do that. You can feel free to put a question in the chat, or I think there's a way to, actually, I believe that's the way you need to do it. I think you have to put a question in the chat if you have one. I'm not sure, Michael, if we have a way for them to unmute and speak, but I
You
think
could
you do best.
have them raise hands too.
Well, when you want to, I know I have a summary of questions that came through the chat earlier, so I don't know if we've addressed all those questions just yet. And the first question was for Matt Tester. Are there any grants or funding for pre-disaster safety assessment activities? And that was tagged for Fema or Cal-OES to answer that, or perhaps that was covered in the training.
And Joe had some answers for that too as well.
Okay.
Yeah, just to kind of specify on that, there is the hazard mitigation grant program, which I did mention in the presentation, which you're able to get a local hazard mitigation plan out of that grant. And that helps you know all your risks and everything in your area. So that way you're able to mitigate those. So that's a type of preparedness grant. Maybe not the exact one they're talking about, but it's the one that came off or that I could think of.
Great. And it was a second part to that question. Where does the district with Cal-OES SAP evaluators complete an ATC-20 go? I guess basically, where do you submit that?
Yeah, that I don't know. Does Cal-OES know the answer to that? Whose form is that?
Sorry about that. The wife called, important things, so I apologize. What was the question?
So the question was, where does the district submit the Cal-OES SAP evaluators form, like the ATC-20? Where does that go?
So that would go back to Cal-OES has the SAP program, and then that form would get submitted back to the program itself for basically record keeping. Once you are approved as an SAP or a safety assessment program person or representative, it's basically going to be kept and housed there. But outside of that, it will be used with the district. It will be used for the county. So the county is going to ask for that as well, or at least it should ask for it as part of that evaluation program. So it's going to be kept in those kind of two places. But once you've completed that whole training and you've got your certification, it ends up being maintained by the state and the county.
Great. Thank you. I hope that answered your question, Matt. And then Joe Anderson, I think this is probably covered during your presentation. He had inquired about where there is a hazard mitigation grant program and which FEMA grant administers through Cal-OES. And I believe it's something that you all covered already in your presentation, but perhaps we can respond to Joe Anderson in the chat. And then, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I think that was my response to that question. So yeah, that's pretty much what I just said. So I think we're good there.
We're covered. Okay, and then I would say I agree with Brian. If anyone has a few minutes and want to raise their hand and go ahead, we'll see what we can do to answer your question. We have 7 minutes still. All righty. Well, Juan, would you like to take it away, or Ida?
Thank you, Lisa. I think we were obviously pretty thorough since there are no additional questions, so that's a good sign. I'm just going to close today. I want to thank you all for attending and joining us today. Obviously, this is an incredibly important topic, and being prepared is critical to respond to the state's emergencies, which seem to be happening more often every year. I'd like to especially extend a thank you to our partner at Cal-OES for joining today with such valuable information, and also to Tom Taylor with Paradise Unified School District and Tad Alexander with the Butte County Office of Education for sharing such compelling stories. I think that we all kind of felt a little bit of the how emotional this whole process is and how important it is to be prepared so that when those emotions arise and we're faced with these emergencies, that we can feel confident that we can spring into action. We are here, DSA, OPSC, and CDE, to assist with your emergency preparation and your response and recovery. So please reach out. I know that CDE and OPSC has provided their contact information on this presentation. Of course, you can find DSA's contact information and the contact of your local regional office on the DSA website on our contact page. It's important to remember to take the survey. We'd like to ensure that these programs are valuable to you. So there is a survey in the link, but you will also be emailed a survey when you registered for this event. So look for that email that's coming to you. Most importantly, in that survey, we want to hear from you what you want to hear from us next. We look to bring you our next presentation in approximately 3 months. And we at DSA, OPSC, and CDE have enjoyed actually collaborating and bringing these presentations to you. Again, one more time, thank you for attending today. And we look forward to seeing you soon.